Today we'll be going over our first impressions of Aetherdrift Draft. For those new to the channel, our first impressions episodes attempt to give you the most helpful information to immediately improve your win rate in under 10 minutes. The first observation is that this format is very different from pretty much every other format over the last 2 years. The format is very slow, and regularly gets into board stalls. Red-White Aggro, for instance, usually one of the best archetypes in the first week of the format, is by far the worst archetype, winning a full 2% less often than the next worst archetype, Blue-White. What makes this format slow is that the aggro cards aren't particularly powerful, and creatures' power quickly get outclassed by your opponent's creature's toughness. But we've had a slower set recently, where the same was true with Foundations. Foundations was slow, but didn't have as many board stalls. That's because Foundations included a lot of attrition-based discard and removal effects. Aetherdrift has great removal, but its quantity is limited at only around 2/3 of what most other sets provide. Aetherdrift also has a number of high-stat creatures, which tend to land and stay around, threatening to make your opponent's attacks bad, given defenders can choose how to block. So how do you win in these board stall games? I find the answer comes in two flavors: out-resource your opponent and evade your opponent. And now we'll dive into those concepts deeper. You can out-resource your opponent in 3 ways: on cards, on exhaust effects that kind of act like cards, and on mana cost. There are also 2 common ways to evade your opponent in this format: direct damage or by flying over them. You can out-resource your opponent with cards like Pothole Mole. In fact, I'm most often playing 18 lands of this format with how slow it is and how mana intensive it is. You can also search for more permanents with Beast Rider Vanguard, or generate several 3/3s with Autarch Mammoth. Search for more vanilla creatures with Fang Druid Summoner. You really only need 1 or 2 vanilla creatures to make this good, especially since it can search your graveyard for those creatures. Elvish Refueler allows you to use your exhaust over and over again, and Ranger's Refueler keeps drawing cards on top of exhausting. Stock Up is just probably the best divination we've ever seen. Getting 2 cards for 3 mana is okay, but allowing you to select the 2 most important out of 5 is huge. I think Howler's Heavy is still a bit underrated. That cycling ability is often destroy a creature, draw a card, and while it's nice to have the buyout of a 4 mana 3/4, that's usually underclassed. And so I really look for the opportunity to use Howler's Heavy as a 2-for-1 when I can. Thunderhead Gunner was as good as we predicted prior to the format. It's a great way to turn your less powerful cards into more powerful cards, and the same can be said of Keen Buccaneer. I especially like small resources that can grow bigger in this format. Cards like Stampeding Scurryfoot allow you to be mana efficient. You can usually find 1 extra mana to be able to play this card early, and then spending 4 mana to get 4/4 worth of stats is also a good payoff. Similarly, Skystreak Engineer can be an early play that grows and eventually evades your opponent. It's often important in this format to ensure that your small resources can trade with your opponent's bigger resources. So creatures like Venomsac Lagak, which is great on defense but also a viable offensive creature, cards like Maximum Overdrive to save a creature of yours and kill one of theirs, and cards like Engine Rat all work well in this kind of principle. I don't love the small resources that can't compete against your opponent's bigger ones. The format is slow and your small creatures are likely to get outclassed later in the game. In this format, I'm willing to go down to only 5 plays of 2 mana or less, whereas usually I'm not recommending any less than 6 and sometimes even higher than that. On a related note, mostly unconditional removal is great to ensure you can pick off the important threats. A card like Flood the Engine is premium, Ride's End's good, even Scrap Compactor, although not mana efficient, is good just to ensure you can kill whatever could kill you. There's cards like Spin Out. Run Over, although not unconditional, can usually act unconditional in a green deck with a lot of big creatures. And Crash and Burn, while not killing everything, can kill most things. I try to get as many of these as possible, and I'm willing to splash for them. I worry less about small removal, like Lightning Strike or Road Rage, because I just plan on outclassing their small creatures. I'm not even a giant fan of Grin Bobble, but admittedly it works well in decks with artifact synergies. And that leads us to evading your opponent with direct damage. These 2 cards are strong win conditions in the format. Haunt the Network, which I'm playing in any of my artifact-driven decks, and the same with Packdoll Terror. I'll often splash these cards in a deck like Blue-White, for instance. The way I've most often been winning has been flying over my opponent's board. This is using flyers like Sabotage Strategist. While I was down on this card in spoiler season, I now see that it could be a significant player, especially with how little removal there is in the set. I also like a lot of the other big flyers, like Memory Guardian. In general, I try to have my decks both out-resource and evade my opponent. If I can achieve both those goals, I'm highly likely to win. Perhaps the best advice for early in this format is to draft the winning colors. Green is clearly the best color. Blue and black are clearly tier 2. Red is clearly worse than those other colors, and white seems to be behind red. This means to start in green, blue, or black when possible. A good red rare can get me to start there, but nothing can get me to start in white unless it's splashable. I'm willing to pivot into any color pair but white-black. White-black doesn't seem to be solved, even by the top players. And then I'm hard avoiding red-white, because it just can't compete against the bigger colors. This is definitely a different color strength order than we predicted when the set was spoiled, but in our next episode, we'll do a retrospective on what went wrong. See you then!